Hi, and welcome to the Data Strategy Gurus podcast. Today we have Tanya Bragin, the VP of Product at ClickHouse. Tanya, welcome to the show. Maybe you can help us out and tell us a bit more about your journey in the data and analytics space and how you came to be the VP of Product at ClickHouse.
Thank you for having me on the show. Yeah, happy to share. As probably many professionals, I didn't know growing up or even when I was at the university that I would, first of all, end up in a data space. And certainly I didn't even know what a product manager was. So what happened was I was in grad school, actually. And before that, I spent a few years in consulting and I was trying to figure out how to combine my deeply technical background. I was studying distributed systems at the University of Washington with kind of business orientation and practical application of what we were kind of researching at that time. And my professor recommended looking into product management. And so I was lucky enough to join a startup. I considered bigger companies, but I was lucky enough to join a Seattle-based startup called Extrahop. And that's really where I learned what it means to be a product manager in a deeply technical space. At that point, I didn't consider myself to be in a data space, but of course I dealt with data. This was a company focused on network analytics, and we actually built our own database to store network telemetry because at that point, this was embedded devices and it had to be hyper optimized to run in that device. And eventually I went to Elastic, a company behind Elasticsearch, after spending quite a bit of time with Extrahop. And that was really when I realized data is just a huge space. Machines produce data, applications produce data. It needs to be searched. It needs to get aggregated. There's real-time aspects to it. There's historical aspects to it. And frankly, I just fell in love. And so my time at Elastic, I spent 7 years there. I learned a lot, both about data and open source. And now I'm at ClickHouse. This is another company that's also focused on real-time analytics. Happy to talk about it. But, the idea is that I really enjoy working on products that help data practitioners and developers build effective applications. And, happy to share my experience. And again, thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, you just said you did some distributed systems, very technical, low level. If I understand, you even helped build the base layer out of that. But what made you fall in love with the data management aspect? Data is still the level a bit up, but still pretty technical, untangible for a lot of people.
Yes. So, I guess what I realized, when I was at Extrahop, we took the hard road, right? We built our own database for a very specific use case, but most, teams don't need that. They don't need to do that. And so they need to adopt an off-the-shelf data store. And again, at that time, of course, there were commercial databases. Oracle is a great example, right? Of a great database that has helped a lot of teams scale their analytics. But over time, there's been just this explosion in different types of data stores, including open source options. And it's just such a vibrant landscape. And so data management becomes really a set of choices of which technology do you adopt for which use case. What are the trade-offs in having kind of a single focus on one system that tries to do everything versus best of breed, and helping teams make those decisions. It's non-trivial to actually make these trade-offs. I talk to a lot of customers that, kind of struggle with that. They say, okay, like, do I, look at the new shiny thing all the time, or do I, really take care about which technologies I adopt when? Because it's a non-zero investment for teams to kind of go with the new technology.
Yeah, and where you say, okay, where you see the market is going, you have, I see the two paths going. So the best of breed, so one tool that fits all, but you have the hyper specialized databases as well, or data platforms. What I see developing. What is your feeling on where it's going, or is it really? Do we really need to make a choice? And it depends a bit on the use case and the industry you're in.
Yeah. So again, my perspective comes a little bit from working with analytical workloads. Extrahop, Elastic, now ClickHouse have all focused on helping customers analyze events primarily. And the way I see the world is there's source of truth, which are typically objects, and you have to write those into transactional databases. It's very important that those are kept consistent. But then when it comes to doing something with that data to either analyze it internally or to build applications for your customers with the focus on analytics. Event data, which is typically time indexed, is a very different workload. from a transactional workload that might be, present in another database. And so the way I see the world is increasingly, I think a pattern needs to emerge where teams realize from day one that they need both. I know there's this concept of HTAP, trying to combine the two. My perspective on that is it's hard. It's hard to do both. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's hard. And in the end, it kind of locks you into a single vendor with their choice of a transactional database and an analytical database in one. And for such critical choices, I actually do believe a best of breed approach makes sense. Pick a transactional database or databases that make sense for your workloads. Pick analytical database or databases that are a fit for your workload, and really recognize that you need both. And both are, again, I call them databases, but these are really data platforms because they have to perform at scale. Usually you have to deal with clustering beyond a single node. And so this is something that is fundamental, I think, to the way that we build applications, write data, analyze data in the business. And again, I come at it more from the analytical side, given my background. But what I am seeing is just increasingly the teams recognize that they need both, and their choices in each space are kind of it's a non-trivial choice, like what technology to bet on and why.
Yeah, you see, really when you're pushing the edge, not to the edge, but pushing the edge of the technology, then you're better off with the hyper-specialized solutions, if I understand what you're saying.
Yes, correct. Yeah, especially for teams dealing with a lot of data. Like I can understand if you're a startup and you're just starting out and time to market it is everything, and you just really want to pick a simple path and you're not yet at scale, at that point, we even see people just pick one database. Maybe it's a transactional database. They don't have that much analytical data yet, and they just go with it. And that's okay. I'm not saying that's the wrong approach. But even a small startup can generate a lot of analytical data very quickly. So we see a lot of teams quickly recognizing that now they have to migrate this workload. And it becomes kind of a fire drill because they may already have, again, as a smaller team, paying customers, and they're having to go through this, fire drill migration to something like ClickHouse, say from Postgres for the analytical portion of their workload. So I get the choices, sometimes you just go with what you know because you're just starting to build. It makes sense. But for the teams to recognize that you need both, and kind of prepare for that eventual migration, even at an early stage of, say, a startup or a mid-sized company. Again, machines can generate a lot of data. Applications can generate a lot of data. There's lots of public data sets out there. Data is ever present, right? And so our capacity to generate more just keeps growing every day.
Yeah, exactly. In your recent article as well, you talked about the unbundling of cloud data warehouses. Can you elaborate a bit on what that means for businesses today?
Absolutely. So now we're going a little bit more from developers building applications to internal teams, dealing with data, oftentimes historical data that their businesses have amassed over the years. Of course, this data keeps growing because new data sets come in. One thing that I've seen in the past, 5 or so years, right? Data warehouse, just kind of rewinding, of course. These are the systems that were established, decades ago to help businesses centralize important data for decision making. This was a time when applications each kind of had their own embedded database. So how would a business kind of keep track of that data centrally for effective decision making? This is why a data warehouse was born. It was a really critical development for businesses that wanted to be and needed to be data driven. And vendors like IBM, Oracle, others, eventually Hadoop is the open source alternative, really help businesses become data driven and start valuing data as part of their business. But for a long time, these systems remained on premise, and I would say they were a bit of a walled garden, right? So unless Oracle or IBM had an integration with some other part of your ecosystem, you kind of had that one place where you did everything, and you couldn't necessarily leverage it for many use cases outside of whatever was enabled by that vendor. And so to me, when the shift to the cloud started happening and cloud data warehouses like Redshift, Snowflake, BigQuery enabled teams to move these workloads to the cloud environment, this was a fundamental shift in kind of ability of teams to leverage this data in multiple use cases. Because cloud is just natively more enabled for integrations. And the team started saying, okay, this data set is now in the cloud. What should we actually be using it for? And sometimes they said, let's start building new types of applications with this data. Let's build analytical applications maybe that we haven't built in the past. Why not? But this is where, if you think about the kinds of applications that we all use today, they're very different from, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, back when traditional data warehouses were built. They were optimized for more batch-oriented ad hoc analytics workload. You configure a report, you run it. And today, if you're talking about building applications, both for external and internal users, it's increasingly expected to have the kind of UI that is data-driven, but very interactive. You have charts and you're filtering them, or you have a search bar and you're searching for something. It's not a report that you schedule, or it's not a query that you run and that you come back to kind of see it. Those workloads still exist, but when, users in the cloud using cloud data warehouses now try to build these interactive applications, they run into challenges. And so what we're seeing now, and that's what we call an unbundling of the cloud data warehouse, is that teams are looking at their cloud data warehouse and they're basically saying, okay, which of these workloads still makes sense to keep in a data warehouse or a data lake? There's kind of this question of like, should I be using a data lake house, data warehouse, and which ones maybe make sense to run in a real-time database or a real-time data warehouse, as I call it, for these interactive analytics. And I'm happy to talk about the choices. I mean, there are some technical constraints on the current cloud data warehouse architecture that makes it difficult to adopt for these interactive data-driven applications, and why the teams are having to make the choice to kind of move some of these workloads out for a more optimized data store for real-time analytics.
Yeah, interesting that you bring that on. I mean, traditionally, the data warehouses batches, we were already happy to see some static information and see how last week went. But these days with online, a lot of data, e-commerce, you have the tendency, and to my feeling as well, a newer architecture, you should look at having that real-time aspect or near real-time aspect, and not with the batch load. I think it comes as well in how you use the compute and the storage of the cloud data warehouses. And if you do that in exactly the same architecture approach as the on-prem, yeah, your costs are skyrocketing. So can you dive into how these real-time data warehouses are different from the traditional ones, and why businesses really need to focus on that real-time aspect?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple of things. You mentioned one of them, which is the freshness of data. How often is a new data set loaded? Is it every week? Is it every day? Is it every hour? Or is it continuous? Like I said, real time or near real time, where it's seconds or minutes, like fresh in terms of new events coming in. And again, frankly, for some use cases, it's not important to have continuously loading data. For some use cases, it's okay to have a data loading strategy that is a little bit more batch oriented. But for instance, for these data driven applications, like I'll give you an example, right? So I'm a product professional and I use SaaS services to help me understand what users are coming to my website. And, when it comes to my cloud business that I'm building, like what is the experience that the users are having right now? I need to break down multiple data sets to kind of understand up to the minute performance of the product that I'm responsible for building inside ClickHouse. And, many professionals today rely on tools like this. For these types of tools, it's very important that the data set is continuously loading. So that's number one. Real-time data warehouse combines both continuously loading data sets up to the minute at least kind of data, and then also historical look back. Because as much as I want to see the experiences users are having right now, I need to go back, weeks, months, sometimes years, if I need to answer a question that's a little bit more business intelligence oriented in nature. So that's number one, kind of how fresh is your data. The second one is how concurrent is like the number of users that your data warehouse is meant to support. In traditional data warehouses, including the cloud data warehouses, the assumption has been that these are internally facing workloads, and maybe there's a dozen users, maybe there's even up to 100, but not like thousands. There's not like necessarily thousands of clients coming in. Whereas if you're building a SaaS offering with this kind of externally driven workload, these could be thousands of users, coming to use your SaaS application. Just a very different set of concurrent user sessions to handle. And, some cloud data warehouses just hard limit you. Others, you could try to scale it out to that, but this is where you run into a challenge of cost, which I'll talk about in a minute. And sort of the last part is latency. Again, how interactive is the query? Because in the end, if I'm building an application and the user is meant to be interacting, there is something about like, like we detect latency at about like a second. Like ideally you want like a sub-second latency in terms of like clicking a button and something happening. We can tolerate like maybe up to like a second and a half, 2 seconds. It'll feel sluggish, but it'll still be interactive enough. Once you go into like 5, 10 seconds, it's slow. People are not going to, like, think about yourself. You come to a website and you search. If it takes 10 seconds for every action, you're not going to use that in an interactive manner. So if you're building an interactive app, that latency of sometimes very complex queries on a lot of data has to be ideally a second or below, millisecond as we call it. So those are the 3 things: fresh data, concurrent sessions, up to potentially thousands, and sub-second latency of complex queries on, sometimes terabytes of data, if not more. So those are the requirements. And again, you can see how this workload, it can be thought of as specialized, but actually a lot of applications today have this exact characteristic. And a lot of businesses, to differentiate in the marketplace, are building these types of applications, both for external and internal users, to kind of make decisions faster.
Yeah, I think these are very good guidelines, what you give on the freshness, concurrency, and the scalability, and as well where people previously were only building systems for internal usage, where they now expose it to external users, which comes into play where you have more concurrent users at the same time. So your business usage of the platforms become differently in such a way. How do you see as well generative AI? It's all over the place right now, and large language models are tapping into the data management space and the strategies. Do you think they will help us become faster, data-driven? And how do you see that happening?
So generative AI is an interesting space because it's new to a lot of us. We're still trying to figure out, first of all, what kind of applications will we be building using this technology. The obvious ones businesses are exploring right now is, simply better chatbots or, kind of better help systems, assistants. And those are non-trivial new applications to build. But I think, frankly, we just don't even know what new applications will emerge from the space. So a couple of things, I guess, for data teams to keep in mind, and what we're seeing, like customers asking us about where to apply our technology. Because there's a few stages. All teams have data that could potentially be used for training. So there is a question of ad hoc analyzing existing data and determining which data sets you might be using for training your own models, or maybe tuning existing large language models. This is ad hoc analytics. Sometimes it's even local, right? And so for that, do you need like a real-time data warehouse? Probably not. You probably have existing ad hoc analytics tools that you use to kind of reach out to your data lake. Like this is, again, like whatever as an analyst you're using right now for local or semi-local analysis is probably what you need to continue using. But then once you decide on this data set, you may need to build a data pipeline for kind of transforming these data sets on the way to actually training models. This is platforming work. This is, again, where potentially a real-time data warehouse helps, because this needs to happen, kind of in a continuous manner. And again, you may need visibility into these pipelines. You may need to, again, have reporting. And so some of our users started using us kind of as an event platform to transform this data and analyzing this data, right? Because again, it's yet another data problem. So that's on the model producing side, which data sets you use and how do you get them to the models. On the model consuming side, there's a question of, do you need to do something like you have, a model that you're able to leverage as part of your application, but how do you leverage it? And sometimes there's this concept of vector search. What is that? This is basically a way to take an existing data set, transform it into vectors so that you can do a certain type of search that hasn't been done before, a certain type of lookup, basically, that is, exactly leveraging this large language models. This process of taking existing data, transforming it into vectors, storing vectors, and then searching those fast, that's the consumption side. And right now, the big questions for the data team is, again, talking about specialization or not, do we need to adopt a very specialized vector database? Or will our existing databases, Postgres, Elastic, ClickHouse, others, develop sufficient sort of vector search capabilities that we don't have to, because we have data gravity in these systems? And I think the jury is still out. Again, I kind of see it both ways. If you have a super large scale, super specialized vector search use case, probably you should look at one of these specialized databases. But if you don't, at least like where we see our customers right now, if they're using ClickHouse for fraud analytics at scale and they have heuristic based fraud analytics and they just need to add, some maybe even lower scale vector search like way to do fraud analytics, they may just leverage the same database, assuming that performance characteristics of vector search that we added is sufficient. We're not going to be leveraging GPUs. We're not going to be doing it at gigantic scale, but it may be sufficient for your use case. So I think the teams will have to make that choice. Comes back to like, where does it make sense to adopt a specialized database and where does it not? And the teams will have to, I think, evaluate it workload by workload.
Yeah, it's kind of starting up with your Excel data set. And if it's not enough, then you scale up to a real data platform, a real database. But I see as well the tendency of a lot of the vendors for the databases, they're embedding as well some vector capability in their platform because they see a lot of people are integrating the large language models in the platform to build on top of the data what they already have. But I see a different approach as well in helping the vector databases and the generative AI models as well in doing data management. So spotting data quality issues, optimizing your data pipelines and so on. So that's another direction what I see and not purely on the technical level.
Absolutely right. I had forgotten about this one. Exactly. Like now, like this concept of observability, you have to now bring it to this use case. I mentioned the data pipelines, but the consumption side as well needs to be monitored and observed. And that's a really hard problem. So at ClickHouse, again, we built an AI assistant. And again, as a product person responsible for it, my biggest question is not even just like at which latency are requests being served. That, of course, like I want to make sure, again, like it's interactive, this AI assistant loads fast enough. But my biggest question is actually, are the suggestions being served to users actually valid? Like, are they gaining value from my suggestions or are they just wrong? Is the model hallucinating? And that is actually still a really hard problem for teams to solve. Like we can collect data, but unfortunately, actually, there's data privacy concerns there. Like I don't want to be collecting all of the queries that our users run because like, again, for me, like maybe I shouldn't be looking at that. And so that question is actually very hard to answer for teams, especially building externally facing products. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see what kind of innovation happens here because I need answers to those questions. If I'm going to introduce something that, for instance, helps ClickHouse cloud users, who don't know like some of our specialized syntax to come up with queries faster. I want to make sure these queries are actually valid and performant. And like answering that question is non-trivial right now, even if you collect the data.
Yeah, so you're using that as well to analyze what users are doing on the platform to help you build a better product. But then we stumble again into data privacy and all those regulations. Yeah, it's a hard choice. It's very helpful. You can build better products, but it's building that trusted source and well, giving that information to you as a product vendor to help me serve better. I think it's going to be a fun discussion in the future.
Exactly right. In many ways, like when I build these features right now, I put a lot of trust. Like right now we're using off-the-shelf models. I'm putting a lot of trust in those models today. Like we've tested it, of course, internally. But again, like we don't know how well they're working at scale for our customers. So far, this is a beta feature, as you mentioned, and like there's always caveats and you always opt in to any sort of data collection. But I think it's going to be interesting. Like the observability piece of it is going to be very interesting in the coming years. I agree.
Yeah, it's where we draw the line for privacy. Am I willing to share my query, what I'm sharing? I have the same aspect when I'm playing around with ChatGPT. You think, am I training the model or am I really benefiting from what I'm getting? So it's both ways on where you say, okay, I'm kind of beta testing this product, but it's returning me value as well. Tanya, you're also an advocate for open source. How do you see this approach influencing the future of data analytics?
Yeah, so this is my second open source company, but I probably should rewind again. When I joined Elastic, I didn't know much about open source. Extrahop was, we used open source, but our solution was a B2B commercial solution. And so with Elastic, it was really eye-opening for me how powerful the open source community is in terms of innovation. What I would say like the biggest benefit of adopting open source and being like open inside your organization and data like management strategies to open source being leveraged is that you can do experimentation at scale without paying licensing fees up front. Of course, if you're hosting open source, on your machines, like you're paying for the infrastructure. But the point is, before you've proven out a use case, you can take an open source data system, deploy it, and just experiment and just sort of prove the value to the business before you, again, go all in on some commercial platform and start paying these licensing fees. What I've seen is that it allows teams and individuals within larger teams sometimes move faster on ideas. So again, generative AI, I think we'll see a lot of open source leveraged to experiment with it because again, there are less or no strings attached to kind of an open source way to experiment with something. Then I think for the data teams, the question is, do we keep the open source experiment or do we move it into an existing data platform? And again, each team will have to kind of make the determination themselves. Sometimes, especially if like the open source based solution already got productized, like why fix what's not broken, then you may just say, okay, like we leave this one off and, we get like some commercial support. Maybe we move to a hosted model. What I've seen at Elastic is usually if that happens, this platform may eventually start getting leverage for other use cases. Because the reason you've kept it around is probably it has something unique about it in the way it serves its workloads. And usually data platform teams find other users of those workloads. So what we've seen actually work very well is if you go that route, do a lunch and learn within your organization, you might find out there's other usage of this open source and you can just onboard them all onto this platform over time. So you can consolidate but it's just a natural channel for innovation. And I just would encourage teams to be open to like open source solutions kind of being leveraged, experiment with, but then sort of follow up on how you productize it within your organization, how you make sure it's managed in a compliant way, in a way that's actually supportable by the data platform team.
Yeah, it's a platform. It's a tool for enabling innovation. And you brought up an interesting point as well, where you say lunch and learn and involve other people to make benefit of it, or they have different ideas on the use cases, what they can bring in. I saw in a lot of companies as well, especially in public services, they are kind of more afraid of open source because they don't have anybody which they can hold responsible for the software in there. Who do we hit on the head if something goes wrong, and where can we go to get that real support? They solve it by intermediate agencies that take up that responsibility. Do you think that could be a blocker for the future?
Well, so it depends on the open source. A lot of open source do have a commercial backing company. That was the case with Elasticsearch, and eventually Elastic became the backing entity for it. And then with ClickHouse, again, there's ClickHouse Inc. behind the open source. So when that's the case, you always have the ability to go to the vendor that's, most open source projects have like a company that's the major contributor to it. Even if it's part of foundation, there's usually somebody, some entity driving the innovation in that open source project, even though there's a major set of contributors coming from the outside. So find that main contributor. If there's a commercial entity behind it, they may offer both training services, professional services, support. Elastic did, obviously, like with any technology, that is like table stakes. Increasingly with open source, there is also a hosted model that these commercial vendors provide. And again, it's not for everyone. We recognize that many of the people that adopt ClickHouse will continue to self-manage it. And that's great. Like we want them to be successful in that model. But for some teams, especially if they're already self-managing in a cloud provider, right? So say you're self-managing in AWS on an EC2 instance. Why not just buy that as a hosted offering through, say, even AWS Marketplace from the vendor? Now you don't have to, deal with upgrades. You don't have to deal with ongoing maintenance. Often these hosted cloud offerings actually have an evolved architecture that's easier for both maintenance as well as kind of running at scale. So as an example, ClickHouse went with a separated storage and compute architecture in the cloud. There's automatic scaling of compute, both up and down. So from a cost perspective, actually a cloud could be cheaper because again, on a self-managed version, you don't have some of these capabilities and you're kind of over provisioning for peak use. So carefully examine what makes sense for you to stay self-managed, to go with a hosted model. Again, not everybody can, due to, again, data privacy. But definitely take a look at like what the vendor behind the open source provides and evaluate if it makes sense for your team.
Yeah, so really taking benefit of the knowledge that has been put into the managed service. Yeah.
And also leverage the community. I forgot like one other subject because I didn't know much about what an open source community is before Elastic and before ClickHouse. I mean, this is basically everybody that's adopted it and that's using it at scale. And like with any technology, but especially in open source, there's a really strong culture towards sharing. I think that's one of the way users give back is they publish technical blogs. They say, this is how we use it. This is how we solve these problems. There's always going to be a community chat that is free and supported both by kind of the creators of the project and the community. So definitely leverage that. Like that is one aspect that's really vibrant about open source. And if you can participate, another thing that's come back again after, COVID, like we're all now a little bit more open to meeting in person, is in-person meetups. Often they run in almost every city globally. And so you actually have ability to meet with some of these experts locally that are maybe leveraging it and talk about your experience, right? So for instance, like how do you operationalize open source? Like how do you make some of the choices I just made? Leverage others in your region to kind of meet with experts and see what their experience has been like. Sorry. Yeah. Just wanted to mention that part.
No. I'm really intrigued and I'm happy that you share this community working that is so valuable to a lot of people. What are you, even sometimes in organizations, what you are missing out? People are afraid of sharing because they're afraid of losing their position. And that's why they keep everything to themselves. But that's something I like as well by sharing it. You see startups are more open to that and willing to help the community. So definitely there is still a big future for open source and backed up by commercial organizations. Yes, this is the way to go and share more knowledge instead of putting a patent on and everything and getting big money out of that. So that's a bit my vision I have on that. Based upon what we've been discussing, what are the emerging trends that you see in the data and analytics space that people working in the data and analytics space should be aware of?
Yeah, so we already talked about the rising importance of analytical systems, and again, maybe I'm biased, but again, I think that HTAP, it's hard to make it work right. Like even like talking with users that leverage Snowflake, a wonderful vendor, right? That now has Unistore. It's hard to build and it's an amazing analytical system, but like building a transactional store right next to it, it's just hard. It's a hard problem. Why not specialize? So again, my perspective is choose a transactional platform, choose an analytical platform, combine the best of the breed. But definitely rising importance of analytical systems is something to keep in mind. On the analytical side, we already talked about unbundling. And one thing that I forgot to mention then is the aspect of cost, because I talked about the three challenges there, the freshness of data, the concurrency of queries, and the latency. To be completely transparent, you can solve that in a cloud data warehouse with just throwing more compute at the problem. But then your costs rise, not exponentially, but what we've seen is anywhere 3 to 5 to 10x, which is really significant. And if you can solve a problem, in a much more efficient way, usually kind of where I see switching costs start to make sense is anywhere over 2x. Basically, because you have to move the data set out. You may need to organize it differently. You have to learn new technology. But if your costs at scale are more than 2x kind of covered by this move, the team should carefully look at it. And again, what we see is, nothing bad to say about Snowflake, Redshift, and BigQuery, because these systems, again, enable teams to take critical workloads, move them to the cloud. But when you're looking at real-time analytics and kind of the cost benefit of moving a workload out, just keep in mind that the teams I see today, the way they are solving their real-time needs inside a cloud data warehouse is providing more and more compute or provisioning more and more compute, but the costs are often 3 to 5 to 10x of what you could get if you took a real-time data warehouse instead. So that's on the analytical side. The last thing I wanted to mention, there's this concept of X as a data problem, right? So but in the end, if you're using some point solution and it's driven by data, there's a question of do you leverage an off-the-shelf solution or do you build an internal data platform for it, especially for bigger organizations? And the trend that we're seeing right now in observability is kind of it started off as something you kind of leveraged, something like Splunk, say for log analytics. Then you had a trend towards something like Elastic, maybe, to adopt. Then there was Datadog, again, kind of into SaaS. Right now, we're seeing a little bit of a backlash. Teams, again, asking themselves for observability, does it really make sense for us to leverage SaaS solutions, or is it another data problem? Does it make sense for us, at least for a subset of the workload, again, to go with a best of breed solution? At least at ClickHouse, we're seeing quite a few users, especially with bigger teams that have data platform teams, explore building their own observability stack. With ClickHouse being part of it, we're not a full solution, but ClickHouse could be, for instance, your log store. You may leverage something like Grafana for UI, maybe another UI, but teams that have the skill set already to manage event data platforms are carefully looking at their SaaS bills and basically are saying, okay, like if we have something like Datadog, again, a wonderful solution, but if it's from a cost perspective, not the right thing for our business, maybe we should treat observability as a data problem and kind of, again, unbundle that basically and move that into our data platform. So just wanted to mention it. Again, the way I see it is these cycles of bundling and unbundling, they kind of, the pendulum swings back and forth. There's no right answer. In the end, every organization has to figure out what's right for them.
Yeah, being in the data space for more than 30 years as well, I've seen that happening. And I was just thinking about that, where you say it's really a cycle. And depending on the new technology that it becomes available, you have the tendency to go left or right in this respect. And how do you see the evolution of data management in the coming years? A lot of companies are still shouting, we want to become data driven, but don't really get it right away. A lot of challenges on data management in itself, the frameworks, the management, but on the technology level, what do you see is happening, and will it become easier?
That's a good question. I think the biggest challenge internal users face to adopting like systems, like I can tell you, like internally for us, we leverage ClickHouse as a data warehouse. Of course we do, right? We drink our own champagne. One of our biggest challenges, of course, is, well, what is this data actually? Like having like an omnipresent data catalog that would tell anybody in the human terms how to actually even like think about what this data point represents is still the hardest part between like the computer and human interface. The catalog technology is still not standardized. I wish it was. I wish we all had just like this one understanding of like how a data catalog is built, and then every vendor integrates with it. The closest I've seen there in the data lake side with the Iceberg kind of like community, they're advocating for this standardized open data catalog. This is what I miss. This is what I wish, the data community really kind of aligned on. I think from a human perspective, like leveraging data, this would really help for internal teams to have this as a standard everywhere. And again, all vendors sort of aligning with that standard. I guess you asked me about trends. My prediction, I would say, is that this technology does get developed because internally, again, like it's going to be just business critical for all of us to leverage data, for instance, to build better applications that are enabled by machine learning and AI. So it's going to become business critical to enable more and more people to work with the data, to discover what data sets to train. So I think that is going to change and evolve, and there's going to be industry level conversations about it. The other prediction I have is that we're all going to be thinking very deeply about where to leverage some of these large language models to help external users, right? Again, my AI assistant that I've built is just a beta product. I'm thinking very hard next year is what else to build for my users to help them, right? Adopt our cloud, to learn ClickHouse. That's always the biggest challenge in adopting new products is learning. I think AI is going to help us learn faster and just kind of achieve proficiency faster. But again, it's an unsolved problem, how to leverage those technologies.
Yeah. Challenging times, but I think the
exciting
speed
times, I
will
would say.
Yeah, exciting, more exciting than challenging. That's how I experience them myself, but the speed is just going up, but we're very well supported by the tools. That's what I see. Still a lot of problems to solve as well. So we're not yet there, but it's really exciting. We had a lot of topics we've been discussing, so I'd like to ask you a few questions, and you just have to say the one or the other. Oh. So what do you think? Cloud data warehouses or on-prem data solutions?
Cloud, but in the middle. I'm going to explain my answer. So again, our customers, when it comes to analytical data, I think they prefer the ease of use of cloud systems. But one of the challenges with the hosted model is that it goes against data gravity if you already have a lot of data in your VPC. And also, again, from a privacy perspective, if you're building applications for external users, you don't want to give that data to third parties. So a new model is evolving. That's kind of a combination of both. Bring your own cloud, as is often call it. It's not new. Databricks has been in many ways kind of the pioneer there, but the new architecture there for analytical system vendors like us is to deploy the data plane in your VPC and deploy the control plane in ours. So you have the combination of like the ease of use for SaaS with the benefits of data staying in your VPC. So I think cloud, but bring your own cloud type of model is really where the analytical space is going to go.
Yeah. And then the next one, early bird or a night owl?
Early bird. And I'll explain that one. For me, so I've been working, so both ClickHouse and Elastic are distributed teams, fully distributed. Europe, Asia. I'm based in the West Coast of the US. So in the San Francisco Bay Area. And, I've noticed early on that my European colleagues, in order to work with me and teams, based on in the US, had to stay up late to like even during dinner time to kind of meet with us. And I don't like that. I think, it's very important for teams to have balance, work-life balance. And so I was thinking about how to really correct for that. So when I manage teams, first of all, I tell my teams based in Europe, block your dinner time. Do not give that up. Like, this is your family time. This is your time to go to the gym. This is your time to take a walk and be sane. On the flip side, how do you meet with me? Like, it kind of leaves only like deep evenings. Like, so I get up at 5 a.m. actually, and I meet with my teams if I need to at 5 or 6 a.m. I've completely adjusted to this lifestyle. I go to sleep very early. Oftentimes my daughter is like, I'm not tired. I'm like, I'm tired. Like, we're going to go to sleep. So definitely early bird, but not because of preference, it's because just distributed teams, it takes work. And it has to be on both sides. It takes two to tango. And I think it's very important that everybody recognizes they have a hand to play, in making distributed teams work well in a sustainable way.
Yeah, fully understand. I'm in the same kind of position, working globally as well. Real-time analytics or batch processing?
Real-time analytics. Batch processing only yeah, of course. I mean, look, again, coming back to like the reasons, I think more and more applications required. We don't do it because it's fun. It's actually harder to build. It's actually more expensive, right? But more and more applications simply required. And so that's kind of how I see the world. I like to say that real-time apps are eating the world, both in kind of external apps and internal apps side.
Yeah, definitely. That's the way where we are going. That's what I see as well. Open source software or proprietary solutions?
Open source. I mean, again, that's my bias. But we talked about the challenges of sort of like adopting open source unless there's a commercial vendor somehow affiliated with it, right? So again, it's a balance. I think open source is great for innovation, experimentation. In the end, though, teams will need commercial entities behind them in some model that works. And sort of like, I think that we are still in the evolution where we're trying to find which models work best with an open source distribution model from a software perspective. But yeah, I'm betting on open source.
Next one. What do you want to do? Invent a new technology or rediscover a lost art?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Because I feel like every time you invent a new technology, almost every time you're rediscovering a lost art. That's happened multiple times. So yeah, I actually think, I'm going to say invent a new technology though. I think there's still enough to invent that's new.
Yeah, but your tweak is interesting where you say they're pretty close related. Yeah. It's like the, old wine in new bags, what they say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Next one. The time travel to the past or to the future?
Ooh. I think the future. Yeah. I think the past, I mean, there's a lot of romanticism about the past, but I think I can't imagine right now a life without a smartphone. I can't. So future, for me, it's future.
So you're quite happy with the new developments and the new technology, what should enlighten our lives.
Yeah. And
a final one, AI-driven insights or the human-centric analysis?
AI, I would say I'm pretty bullish. I'm pretty bullish on AI. I don't think it's a fad. I don't think it's hype. I think the breakthrough that we have seen in the past year is just incredible. It's just incredible. How it gets leveraged. I mean, it's going to come back to humans leveraging it. I don't think AI is going to take over. I'm not worried about that at all, frankly, but I'm excited about what it brings. I think we will figure out how to use it responsibly. And I think that, we're all going to benefit from this leap. Definitely bullish on AI.
Thanks. So what drives your passion for data and analytics outside of your passion, of your professional life?
So what I really like is discovering new things that are driven by data. And sometimes it has to do with these inflection points. My husband and I, we have this tradition. He cooks me omelet on Saturday mornings. We have a coffee. That's when we often catch up. We're both in tech, right? So we're both kind of deep in our jobs. And then we kind of come up for air and we talk. And one of the things that we like to look at together sometimes is there's a Reddit called Data is Beautiful. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's basically a Reddit where members post interesting, just amazing charts driven by data. And sometimes these data visualizations are just mind blowing, right? Like, and so I don't know. I just looked at the top one today and just randomly says how couples meet in the US. And you see all these channels kind of through family, through friends, work, bar, grade school, neighbors, college, go way down and then online going straight up, right? And again, I've been out of the dating scene forever. Like I'm happily married now for 15 years plus, but it's just amazing to still look at data because the trend is so clear. And so I love data. I think data is beautiful. And that's what I enjoy about it outside of my professional life.
Yeah, it's really the visualization of the data and then seeing the trends and understanding what is happening really. But it's a good takeaway. So data is beautiful on one of the Reddit notes. Okay, let's have a look into depth. Good takeaway. So Tanya, finally, to wrap up, data connects us all, but music connects us as well. So what is your favorite band or type of music?
Okay, so this one's easy. I am totally just a huge fan of Taylor Swift. She is incredible. So how I sort of learned about her, I was at Elastic and I still remember Shai, our CTO, CEO of Elastic, talking about Taylor Swift. And I was like, isn't that like a pop singer? Like, why are you talking about her? And he was like, no. You have to understand that, like, this woman is incredible. Like, you have to just go listen to like the breadth of like talent that she exhibits through her work. And I remember at that point, sort of like, I didn't quite get it, and so over the years, I started listening more and more, and I'm just transformed by her music. My daughter and I are both, really into like just the music that she has. My daughter is 10. We listen to it together. It's really empowering for her as, a girl growing up right now to see this amazing female artist coming up from humble beginnings, like really making in this. And she worked hard for it. Like, I mean, like there's stories of her like playing the guitar until her fingers were raw. And like this is like what it takes, I think, to succeed. So it's very inspiring. It's really amazing that she is Person of the Year this year. I think it's very appropriate. Yeah. So to me, this one's easy. Taylor Swift.
Yeah, not only the music, but the story behind and the passion and the drive to get where she wants to, where she is right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great one. Tanya, it was so great having you on the show. Maybe you can share as a last note where people can find you online, on Twitter, LinkedIn, your website.
Absolutely. And maybe we can add it to the show notes. But yes, I'm very active on Twitter, as well as Medium. I have a personal Medium where I read some articles more on the meta. What is it like to be a product manager? What is it like to work with open source pricing models? So if you're interested in those topics, you can find me on Medium. And finally, I also, I'm on LinkedIn, so happy to add it, but I'm kind of less active there. It's really more for professional networking, but it would be very happy for folks to reach out to me if they want to chat or learn more.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. Thank you so much.